Everybody, Peter Zeihan here, just taking a walk after this guy dumped on us. The big news today, it's February the 5th, is that overnight local time, Iranian-backed militants in Syria attacked another U.S. base. It's the first significant attack since those 3 American soldiers were killed early part of last week. And the United States launched a bunch of retaliatory strikes against Iranian-backed militias throughout the region. Anyway, this is the first significant action by them since, and again, it looks like a drone got through and hit the barracks again. This time, it wasn't American service people who were killed, but a half a dozen Kurds that U.S. Special Forces were training. Let me explain how we got into the Middle East and why it's difficult to get out, and then we'll put this into context. So, going back very roughly, 1,000 years. The Middle East has not been a place that anyone wanted to be. It was on the way somewhere. So you had your more advanced, somewhat, very loosely using this term, technocratic societies with a little higher value add in their economic systems in the West. And then you had East Asia, and to a lesser degree, Southeast Asia and South Asia, that produced goods that you could not find in the West, things like spices and porcelains and silks. And so the trick was to figure out how you could link these two economic systems together despite the vast distances involved. And from roughly 1000 to roughly 1500 AD, the solution was coastal vessels, camels, caravans. The problem with all of those things is you had to go through any number of intermediaries, especially for the land routes. And since the sea routes weren't safe, most people stuck with the land routes. This meant that the folks who lived in between, in the middle, to the east of the Western nations, ergo the name, found themselves having to pay massive markups because you'd send your gold east and you'd bring the cargo west, and every few miles or few dozen miles, there would be another middleman who would take their cut. And so the cost of these products didn't double or triple or quadruple, but typically went up in cost by a factor of 1,000 or so. And so what were not necessarily everyday goods, but not exactly considered exotic goods out east, became the cream of the luxury goods in the West. And so the trick was to how do you avoid those markups? The solution was hit upon by the Spanish and the Portuguese, who developed the technologies to sail farther from the shore. With old coastal vessels, if you happened to anchor, which you had to do every night, within sight of land, there was a reasonable chance that somebody who lived in the neighborhood was just going to come and take your ship and kill your people and take all your stuff. So that's one of the reasons why they tended to prefer the land routes. But with the Portuguese and the Spanish developing deep water navigation, they were able to do an end run around that entire thing, interfaced directly with the east. And so from roughly 1500 until roughly 1900, the Middle East just didn't matter. It became a complete backwater, and eventually the Western countries industrialized, and when they came back to the Middle East, to an area that had not industrialized, you bring a knife to a gunfight enough times, and the locals pay attention. And so you basically had the Brits, the French, and the rest divvy up the entire region into mandates and colonies. Now, why was the West able to pull that off when the Middle East just kind of stayed at the same technological level? To be perfectly blunt, the answer is rainfall. Throughout the Western countries in Europe, it rains. Rain means that you can grow crops in any number of areas, and that gives people an interest in pursuing their own economic destinies. Also, you had winter in most of those areas, so in the off-season, farmers could be working on something else. They weren't exactly getting law degrees, but the point is the overall skill level of the population steadily creeped up. And when you've got a lot of people who are vested in stability in the system, even if it's not a democracy, you get a degree of political stability, economic advancement, technological acumen that you just don't get in the Middle East. In the Middle East, very few places have rain. Where you do have water, it's in a relatively narrow band, either right on the coast or along a river. And that makes it very, very easy for a political authority to rise and dominate that specific geography, and in doing so, basically reduce the entire population to slave status. That does not give people a lot of interest in pursuing stability for the system. It makes revolutionaries very popular, but it also means that the power of the state is just almost total making it very, very difficult for anyone to make something of themselves. So you will get centers of learning throughout the Middle East who did absolutely preserve Western knowledge during the Dark Ages, but they never applied it themselves. They never disseminated it within their own cultures. They were basically just libraries maintained by monks. Oversimplification, 1,500 years of history, I recognize that. But you can't deny the economic trajectory of the Middle East versus the West. And then once the West cracked the code on industrial technologies and they started having gunpowder and cannon, and the Middle East was left behind, there was no contest at all. So now, today, the economies of the Middle East matter more to the world today than they have for most of the last half millennia, largely because of oil, because there is an asset those industrial economies need in order to function. Now, this isn't so much an American problem directly because North America is self-sufficient, well, not even self-sufficient in oil, it's a significant exporter of oil. And if the Middle East were to vanish tomorrow, we'd have some adjustments on things like crude quality, but within a couple of years, we'd be totally fine. However, the Europeans, significantly less so, specifically since the Russian crude is no longer part of their equation. Okay, now where does that bring us? Well, it means that anyone who goes into the Middle East after about 1950 is faced in a very different environment from what was faced from 1000 AD to 1500, when it was just a place you had to push through, or from 1500 until roughly 1950, when the West was industrialized but the Middle East wasn't. Now the Middle East is. And no one's going to say that a group like ISIS in Syria is like the pinnacle of human technology, but it's really easy for them to get explosives and AK-47s. So it's no longer a contest like we saw from 1900 to 1950 between an industrialized Western imperial system and a completely non-industrialized, almost tribal Middle Eastern system. You've got a different makeup now. Now, the governing systems of the Middle East themselves are also in play and very much in flux, because before 1950, you basically had a series of what could be best called fortress political systems, where by dint of geography, maybe they had an oasis like Damascus, maybe they were surrounded by desert like Egypt, maybe they were a mountain fastness like Iran. It's a little difficult to get in and out, and some of these areas are a lot more difficult to conquer than others, Iran probably being at the top of that list. But you introduce industrial technologies to this area in the post-colonial, post-World War II environment, and all of a sudden, they're not just drilling for oil, they're building roads, they're buying military hardware, and it makes for a very different mix. You get this incredibly brittle, top-down, concentrated political system that is absolutely incapable of providing the people with a level of technological progress that is possible elsewhere in the world, because there's very little to work from aside from cash, from oil. And you apply that in a world where society is weak. And the result, you get lots and lots and lots and lots of militant groups. And if you want to back one versus the other or one versus government, that's fine. But even if you win and the militant group overthrows the government, well, then what? You've taken what little order exists in an area and it's turned into chaos. You get complete societal breakdown, as we've seen in places like Egypt and Iraq and Syria in recent years. So, enter the United States. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration felt that the best way to fight al-Qaeda was to make sure that the countries that allowed al-Qaeda to function would go after it. So after the Afghan operation, we discovered that al-Qaeda scattered to the winds, and we found out that a lot of the recruits were coming from Syria, because that was how the Syrians got rid of their own dissidents. A lot of the troops, Taliban troops that were in Afghanistan, fled through Iran to parts unknown, because the Iranians were like, well, we hate these guys, but we don't want to deal with them, especially since they don't like the Americans very much. And then the Saudis, not necessarily the government itself, but a lot of elements within Saudi Arabia were part of the ideological and financial underpinning that made al-Qaeda possible. How do I know that? Because we allied with them back in the 80s to form the Mujahideen, which eventually became the Taliban. Anyway, so the U.S. is looking at this region, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. We're like, well, conquering any of them wouldn't be fun. Conquering all three at the same time to get after a militant group just doesn't seem like the right task. And so the solution that was struck upon was to knock over Iraq and occupy it with armored tank brigades, which is not the way you pacify a population. You want ground infantry for that. The idea is Tehran and Damascus and Riyadh, none of them thought the U.S. was going to do this. And so when it did it with tanks and left the tanks there, they're like, shit, there's nothing to stop the United States from turning on us. And while Iran was to a degree protected by its mountains and had a little bit more confidence it would be able to put up a good fight, the other two had no such confidence. And they knew that if the United States decided to come for them, that their regimes were done. Because there was no civil support. There was no technical competence. There was no cohesion. Well, it worked. And those three countries went after al-Qaeda for us. And are the primary reasons, the strategy is the primary reason, why al-Qaeda is, for all intents and purposes, no more. The problem is that we didn't declare victory and went home. We tried to make Iraq look like Wisconsin, with the results that you can imagine, because again, there's nothing to build from in terms of society. We overthrew what stable order there was and replaced it with nothing. Now, fast forward to today. The W. Bush administration felt they had no choice but to go in. And, we can debate whether it worked out well or not. First phase of the plan, I think, worked. Second phase, Obama changed nothing, despite his rhetoric. Trump said he pulled out, but left troops in places like Syria to fight ISIS because no one in the U.S. political system wants to be blamed for being the guy who allowed that militant group to come back. But here's the problem. The countries in these areas are never going to have the foundation that's necessary to form a country in the way that Americans or Westerners in general, or even Asians, see it. And so if your goal is to prevent the creation or the operation or the resurgence of a specific type of militancy, you will be there forever. And that's one of the reasons why we called them the forever wars, because we found ourselves going to war with a military tactic as opposed to any specific group. And while most of our troops are out of the region now, what happened earlier today in Syria is the best that we can hope for unless the strategy changes. We are never going to be able to turn these countries into something that we would normally recognize as a peer or as even someone in the same category as the nation states that we have in most of the rest of the world. That's not how these areas work. They never have. They don't have the economic geography to try. And so we're left with a fun little discussion we have to have. Option A is stick it out forever, do what most of our forces have been doing in the region since the operation was slimmed down under Trump, and hunker in your bases and watch. And if something like ISIS bubbles up again, hit it with a hammer, go back to your bases, and watch some more. And if you do that, you'll be there forever. And while you're there forever, other militant groups who have their own ideas of who should be in charge will take pot shots at you. And that's what we've been seeing with the Iranians being the instigators. This is the new normal. This is the old normal. This is just what the region looks like. Option 2, leave. From a casualty point of view, it's easy. We're never going to make this area look like something that we want. Danger, if you leave, is that a group that you specifically don't like is going to boil up. Now, let me put that into context. Part of the reason that we're still there is we find the tactics of ISIS beyond repute. And we've seen that replicated in Hamas in the beginning of the Gaza war. We're not going to be able to defeat a tactic. But the fear is if we leave, more of these groups will boil up in a shorter period of time and eventually start not just attacking the locals, but our interests in the region as well. The problem with that theory is that it assumes that there's something better that can happen if we stick around. Something to keep in mind. This is an area of fortress cities. And historically speaking, when you don't have an external power like the United States in, those fortress cities start to enforce their own writ on the area. Now, we have enabled Baghdad to recover from the Saddam and the occupation areas, and it's doing a pretty good job of holding its own. What we're doing against groups like ISIS is basically taking some of the unknowns out of the equation for the other two major powers in this region, which are Damascus, Syria, and Turkey. If the United States were to vanish overnight, they would have to deal with these unknowns themselves. And we would have a much more aggressive effort from both countries to deal with groups like ISIS. That is more normal. And so we're actually in this weird situation where U.S. forces that are remaining in the region, even if they're just staying in their camps, have become the single greatest reason why the government in Damascus still exists. Because under normal circumstances, other regional powers would have moved in and smashed these groups that were patrolling out of existence. And that means the Turks get more involved, that means the Syrians get more involved, and that means the Israelis get more involved. And in that sort of contest, with Mesopotamia kind of acting as an anvil, we'd probably see the end of the Syrian government within 5 years. Of course, it would be bloody and horrible, because this is a region that can barely grow food itself, and it uses a lot of those energy imports or exports to buy food that it imports. So the capacity here for an outright civilizational collapse is very, very real. And agreed, the presence of U.S. forces is one of the few things holding the darkness at bay. Now, whether that is considered an American national interest or not, talk amongst yourselves. Everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Kalea at the southern point of the island of Hawaii. Got the slopes of Mauna Loa behind me, the larger volcano here. I am going to take something from our Ask Peter forum. We're going to put that link here at the end of the video, too, in case you were sending your own questions. And it's, am I worried about Ukraine in the light of what has become an American boycott on weapons supplies? And yes, I am. The Ukrainians are running out of ammo. There's no way they could produce enough to support the war themselves. And the Russians have mustered a fresh human wave. And, human waves are very vulnerable to mass fire, but you have to have ammo for that to work. So there are some concerns we might be seeing a turning point in the war here in the next few weeks if something doesn't change. But what is going on is we've got a dozen, roughly, Republicans on the right who are blocking anything from happening in Congress that they don't agree with. And so this is not a Ukraine problem. This is an everything problem. These few reps are blocking anything on any issue. So we've got programs that need to be addressed, not just Ukraine, but aid for Taiwan against China, aid for Israel against Hamas. There's issues with healthcare and business reform and criminal justice reform, the defense system and the budget. Every single thing has been dropped. It's not that these folks oppose Ukraine per se, it's they oppose anything that isn't exactly their way. So I call them the Greenpeace faction of the Republican Party because they just hate everyone. This means that this Congress has been the least productive in American history. At this stage in Congress, a little bit more than halfway through their session, we've only passed about 20% of the bills that the second least productive Congress in history has passed. So this isn't an issue of big government versus small government. This is just an issue of dysfunction, and it's a problem for everybody. Now, I don't think it's going to get any better any soon. When the Republicans didn't do very well in the last midterms, the hope of getting a big majority vanished. So they had a very slim minority beginning, and they have seen that minority shrink down. In part, it's because they've cannibalized their own. This faction of Republicans forced out the former Speaker, McCarthy from California, and so he just quit. He left the House altogether, leaving that seat open. We've had another couple of resignations since, and then the Republicans purged one of their own, Republican Santos of New York, for, let me make sure I get this right, using campaign finance to purchase gay fetish foot porn. Can't make this shit up. Anywho, what it means is not just that the margin that the Republicans have in the majority has gotten smaller and smaller, it's worse than it sounds. Because to pass something in Congress, you don't need a majority of the votes, you need a majority of the seats. And so every empty seat kind of acts as a quasi-vote against the majority. So they only have the Republicans now only have a margin of 2. They can only lose 1 vote if they still want to get things passed. And that makes each individual faction, including the Greenpeace faction, more powerful. So this is going to go one of 2 ways. Number one, they're going to continue to stall everything, and this Congress will go down in history as the most pathetic ever until we have general elections a year from now, November, and the new Congress would sit in January. Or the bulk of the Republicans reach across the aisle and start cutting deals with centrist Democrats. Now, that's not as easy as it sounds. There's a lot of minutia. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of noise. And in the environment that we're in right now, anyone who reaches across the aisle is inviting a primary challenge from the freak wings of their parties, whether it's the Greenpeace faction or the Republicans or the squad version of the Democrats. So none of these are easy decisions, but they do suggest that drama in Congress is going to increase, or rather than decrease, in the months ahead. And that's not just bad for Ukraine. That's bad for everyone, except for the Chinese who think this is fantastic. All right, that's it for me. Take care. Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from St. John's Cathedral in Detroit, which is also a resort because modern Catholicism. Anyway, I thought it would be a great backdrop to talk about the United Kingdom in our Post-America series. The United Kingdom is one of those countries that is not really going to emerge into a post-American world because they've got some really interesting decisions to make, and I'm pretty sure I know how it's going to go. So, backdrop, two things. First, economy. The British system never really adapted to the end of empire. They do all the high value-added stuff, and they import a lot of the raw materials and some of their base manufactured goods, things that they're not very good at because they're good at the really high precision stuff. And when the empire ended and they joined Europe, all they did was kind of switch one empire for another and relied upon the European continent for things like foodstuffs and wood products and automotive. They never made the transition that all the other former imperial powers did. And so when Brexit happened, they found themselves in a bit of a lurch. So that's kind of the economic side of things. On the security side of things, they are an island, and islands are worried about one thing: other countries developing navies that might allow an invasion. So they've always looked at the major powers of the Eurasian landmass with more than just suspicion, outright fear and concern, whether it's Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia or whatever, Napoleon, and on and on. But that doesn't mean that they like non-military superpowers. So when folks in the European Union start talking about ever closer union and maybe having a common defense identity, they get a little squeamish and they want to keep things within NATO where they've got veto power. So that's the economic, that's the security. You play that forward to where we are right now, and they're in a bit of a pickle. Demographically, the European Union is on its final legs. Most of the major powers, especially Germany and Italy, are going to be aging into obsolescence within a decade, and most of the remaining countries within 2. And I don't mean to suggest that the UK has a super healthy demography, but it is like the second healthiest within the Union. So when the Brits started talking about Brexit a decade ago, I was like, okay, I can understand the conversation. Getting a jump on what's next, leaving the sinking ship that is the economic aspect of the European Union, that makes some sense. But here we are 7 years after Brexit, and the Brits are still trying to figure out what Brexit means. We still don't have a meaningful policy for how they should go into the new world. And they really only have two choices. Option one, since they haven't done that economic change post-imperial era, is to find a new empire and go out and cut a series of deals with a series of countries that have young demographics that can provide them with raw materials and on and on and on. The problem is they can't do it like they did before. Before, the secret of the British Empire, the reason that they ruled the world for the better part of 2 centuries, is they were in the early days of the industrial era and no one else had caught up. So they were able to use the order of magnitude greater economic intensity of early industrialization and the 3 orders of magnitude better power projection of military technologies to dominate wherever they went with a very small number of people. Well, that's not the world we're in anymore. You can't go into a place like India with 50,000 people and conquer it like you could 2-3 centuries ago. Not to mention that the Indians wouldn't let it happen. So the idea that the Brits as a mid-sized power can be the center of a global trade node, that's a bit of a stretch. I don't want to say it's impossible because weirder things have happened in the last few years, but it's difficult to see enough countries signing on to the idea of British preeminence when the Brits can't force the issue. The second issue is to partner with a singular, large, wealthy country that has better demographic structures and shares the United Kingdom's overall security concerns about United Eurasia as a military power. And the only country that scratches that itch is the United States. Now, It's not like what the Brexiteers said, that they can just waltz into Washington and ask for a free trade deal that is better than what comes from the EU. No. When it comes to trade deals, the United States is very specific, and it doesn't like to bring in systems that could compete with it in any meaningful way. And that would mean that the Brits have to accede to American demands on any number of sectors, from agriculture to finance to manufacturing. Hell, we might even make them get rid of the metric system if we're in a bad mood. Now, when the Johnson administration in Britain came over to talk to Donald Trump's administration about a trade deal, and they found out what the conditions would be, they walked away. And then the next government came in and did the same thing and walked away. Or was it Theresa May? Anyway, there were two back to back. And so the Brits right now are in this netherworld where they kind of quietly admit to themselves that in order to find a future that has some degree of economic functionality, they have to get into bed with their kids and accept all the demands. And the hit to their economy will be real, and the hit to their ego will be massive. But the alternative, trying to build an alternate system or maybe going back to the EU, neither of those are long-term solutions that are very functional. So really what we're doing is going through the paces until the Brits admit the obvious. And when that happens, Britain will lose the thing that it values the most, its freedom to act, its agency. It will become a subsidiary of the American system, for better or for worse. And while that will be horrible for the British mindset, it is the best game in town from both an economic and a security point of view, and in time, I have no doubt that that is where the Brits will end up. So, stiff upper lip. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Colorado. It is the 29th of January, and the news today is that in a drone attack, an Iranian militia operating near the border of Jordan and Syria managed to get a drone into an American base and kill 3 people in the vicinity of one of the barracks. These are the first deaths of American military personnel since the Iranians started pushing groups like the Houthis to attack Americans and international commerce in a large volume, and it's probably going to merit a response. Something to keep in mind is when the United States a couple weeks ago decided to start taking military action against the Houthis in Yemen, it wasn't because these Iranian-backed groups were attacking commerce in general. It's because they fired an anti-ship missile at a U.S. military vessel, and that's what started it all off. So working from that same logic, now that some Americans have actually died, you can expect the Biden administration to strike back. The question is how? There's kind of 3 things to consider. None of the options are great. Option number 1, you do a semi-proportionate, because the Americans always believe in overkill, assault against the militias that Iran backs either in the area in question or somewhere in the broader Middle East. The problem with this is it doesn't solve the problem. The people who are doing the attacks aren't Iranian. They're just using Iranian equipment and sometimes a little bit of Iranian intel. And even if you were to wipe them all out, they come from sectarian groups who are opposed to their local geopolitical orders. And so they tend to oppose Sunni groups who tend to be in the majority, especially in places like Jordan, or in the case of Iraq, where you have a pseudo-democracy. And in these cases, even if you were to take them all out, you just have an aggrieved minority that would, again, push people in that the Iranians would recruit. So it might make things calm down for a few weeks to months, but it's certainly not any sort of lasting solution that's going to change the logic in Tehran at all. The second option is to strike military assets in Iran proper. The idea is you go after the personnel that are making these decisions. The problem here is that there's a lot of them. Iran isn't like most strongman autocracies. You've got a ruling elite of the class, the mullahs, who's over 10,000 people. And even if you were to somehow magically carry out an assassination program and within 24 hours kill the top 1,000 of them, I mean, sure, they'd have some reshuffling, but it actually wouldn't disrupt the regime in any meaningful way. In addition, Iran is a series of mountains. It's basically a fortress. And if you wanted to go in there and knock the government out, you would need a force significantly larger than what the United States pushed into Iraq, which is ultimately a flat and somewhat desert community. And that means you're going over mountain range and mountain range and mountain range. So the distances are far. The logistics would be hard. The geography plays to the defender's strength. And then even if you were successful, well, then what? Are you going to stick around and try to reconstruct Iran in the way that we did Iraq? I think the U.S. learned that that's not an easy thing to do. So, and again, this wouldn't change any of the logic in Iran about what they're doing in the broader region. If anything, it would intensify it. That leaves us with the third option, which is a military option against Iran's economy. Now, Iran, while it is nowhere near the peak that it once was back in the 70s as an oil producer when it was exporting more than 4 million barrels a day, is still in the game. It still exports about 1 million barrels a day, and that income is the primary source of hard currency that the Iranians use to fund everything that they do, from purchasing social stability from their population at home to funding these rocket attacks against U.S. military targets throughout the broader region. And unfortunately for the Iranians, it all flows through a single point called Karg Island, which is on the northeast shore of the Persian Gulf. And it would be very, very, very easy for the United States just to destroy the loading facilities or maybe even the storage tanks and the pumping stations in Karg. They could probably do it with a handful of sorties. It would probably take less than an hour. Iranian missile defense is not very good. Their air defense is not very good either. And the U.S. obviously is very good at striking in those sorts of conditions, especially when you're talking about something that is on the coast, so you don't have to fly over too many defensive layers to get to it. There'd be a cost to this, of course. Should the United States decide to do this step, it would take the role of the erstwhile global guarantor of maritime security and have the United States taking very discrete shots at very specific parts of the global economy that have relied upon international security in order to function. And that means that any vessels that are part of a long supply chain, a long sail, going through a dangerous area, near a dangerous area, or have multiple supply chain steps, meaning that if you interrupt just one of them, all of them become defunct, all of that would be in danger. And that is the entire electronic supply chain in Southeast Asia and East Asia. That is the entire oil supply chain, which either is sourced from or passes through the Middle East. The consequences of that would be significant on a global basis. But if you want to take the American populist view, which is something that Biden and Trump agree on, is that a lot of that doesn't really matter. And in fact, there's something to be said for stalling those international systems because they favor North American solutions. The United States doesn't get energy from this region anymore. Canada doesn't. Mexico doesn't. So the economies that we care about the most are heavily insulated already. And the economy that we're most dependent upon or the most concerned about is China. And they get all of their energy from this region. Well, not all, but like half. And so if the Biden administration does take this step, things will very much be in motion very quickly. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from above the very active Kilauea volcano. That's the crater that cooked off last year. Today we're going to talk about an assault that happened last week. The Ukrainians sent a squad of drones north out of Ukraine over Russian airspace into the Gulf of Finland to attack the Uga-Ust, hope I pronounced that right, oil refinery and loading facility. Now, normally this wouldn't really matter because normally drones, as we've been seeing, can't get through any sort of meaningful air defense, but the Russian air defense in this area appears to be just as crappy as it is everywhere else in the country, so a bunch of them got through. The other reason I wouldn't normally care about this is most refineries, everyone gets all ooh and ah, they expect Hollywood explosions when a bomb goes off in a refinery. You gotta keep in mind scale here. Most refineries are over a square mile, and this one's no exception. There's a lot of standoff distance among the different facilities, so if something does blow, it doesn't blow up the whole thing. And crude oil at room temperature isn't even flammable. So the warheads that these bombs can carry, which are less than 100 pounds, probably with the models that were used, probably under 20 pounds, it's not that you can't do damage, but you can't do real damage. But this is not just a refinery. This is also a loading facility. And in a refinery, once you've made your fuels being more flammable than raw crude, you then put them into a truck or a pipe and send it away. With a port facility, you put into a big, giant tank, and then a large vessel comes by and sucks off what it needs and goes on its merry way. And so the tanks themselves are the vulnerable points here. Now, judging from the size of the explosions and the fires that were started, the tanks were not hit. That's just something that you should have in the back of your mind when you're evaluating when somebody says a refiner, a certain piece of energy infrastructure was hit, so you know what to look for. What's interesting here, two things. Number one, it took the Russians more than 3 days to put out the fire. and they put it out the wrong way, using water in, the near Arctic winter, which caused a lot of water to freeze and then expand and wreck more infrastructure. Damage assessments are still underway. We don't know how bad it was, and had this been a normal attack, we would have known within 24 hours whether or not anything substantial had been done. But here we are nearly a week out, and we still really don't have any more but the vaguest ideas, and the facility is shut down. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this matters. Number one, while the Europeans have put sanctions on seaborne crude, seaborne oil product is in a loophole. So they were still taking stuff from this facility, and with its shutdown, all of a sudden, sanctions have gone up to a whole new level, and we're going to have a very good idea of how the Europeans can absorb or not this newest change. Quick add-on, the Ukrainian attack on Ust-Luga was on Sunday the 21st, and less than 72 hours later, the Russians were able to begin shipping out again. However, what is being shipped out is primarily, well, almost exclusively, oil and something called condensate, which is kind of a raw product somewhere between natural gas and oil. The actual refining complex remains completely offline. There's no naphtha, there's no fuel, there's no intermediate products that are coming out at all. And at present, the Russians are still completing their damage assessments. And at the pace they're going, we probably won't have any information on the level of damage until probably March. And then, with their very, very thin remaining skin of skilled labor, they can start talking about repairs. Second, this is the first significant Ukrainian attack against a significant economic asset of the Russian Federation. And at least on the surface, it looks like it was much more successful than they ever thought was possible. That means that the northern parts of the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Finland are suddenly in a danger zone that is well within the Ukrainians' proven range of operation. Now, the Ukrainians and the Russians haven't really gone against civilian shipping right now, but I can't think of a better target than an oil loading and refining platform such as what we've got in Ust-Luga. Again, apologies for the inaccuracy. We're just going to put the spelling right here so you can see what I'm having the trouble with. Okay. So this is the sort of thing we should now watch for in the future, because this is not the only facility of this type which is within the Ukrainians' reach. There are a number of facilities at Novorossiysk on the Black Sea and Tuapse on the Black Sea and closer to St. Petersburg, also on the Gulf of Finland. And now that the Ukrainians have proven that a few things can slip through, you can bet that they're going to target all of them. And all told, if you look at all of the infrastructure combined, its combined export and throughput capacity is in the vicinity of 3.5 million barrels a day, which is about 3.5% of global output. So if you put a meaningful dent in the export infrastructure, it's impossible for the Russians to shunt this stuff somewhere else. There's nowhere else to go. And so it just backs up through the system. There's also one other thing to look at. The fact that the damage control crews proved to be so incompetent is something that we're starting to see at the edges as the Russian economic system frays. The Soviet educational system collapsed back in 1986, which means that the youngest people who are worthy of terms like engineer turned 64 this year. And so when I think of fire suppression, I think of something that normally I could not just pick up the hose and go do it. You want someone with specialized training. And especially if you're talking about petroleum, natural gas, or refined product fires, you definitely want someone who has some idea what they're doing. Russia's running out of those people. It's not just that 1 million people have fled the country and 500,000 have been drafted and committed to the war, been killed. They don't have much of a skilled labor pool left. And what they do have is being dedicated to the war itself, air defense in the vicinity of the war, or the military-industrial complex to keep the war going. So we're seeing some very serious frays with the system. This is not the sort of thing that they should have gotten wrong. That fire should have been put out very quickly with things like foam, and it wasn't. And that suggests the Russians' ability to maintain their overall system is starting to feel the strain of all of this, and they don't have a backup plan. There isn't enough labor in the country to redirect from somewhere else, especially skilled labor. All right. That's it for me. Take care. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Colorado. Now, I get a lot of flack for never having good news, so I figured, here's something fantastic that's happened over the holidays. There's an organization called SunZia, which is a company that produces and transmits electricity, that has closed funding and started construction on what will be the largest green tech power generation system in the hemisphere. 3.5 gigawatts, which in electrical terms is huge. Why does this matter? A bunch of reasons. Number one, $11 billion is how much money they had to raise. Raising money these days is difficult because the baby boomers are majority retired. All of their capital and all their savings has been put into relatively static things like cash and T-bills. And so if you're trying to raise funding for anything, it's gotten a lot more expensive. In addition, unlike if you were to build, say, a natural gas power plant or anything that's fossil fuel-based, with those systems, fossil fuels, only about 1/5 the cost of your full life cycle cost for your facility has to be raised at the front end to pay for construction. But most of it is instead raised from fees when you're generating the power as you go. Instead, with green tech, 2/3 of the cost is up front because there's no fuel cost, but the upfront cost is much higher. So you're talking about 2/3 of the total value of the entire life cycle of the project has to be raised before day one. And so doing that at all is difficult now that capital costs have roughly tripled, but SunZia was able to pull it off. So number one, big achievement for the capital cycle. Number two, the size, 3.5 gigawatts, biggest in the hemisphere. If we are going to do the green transition, we need to increase the amount of power generated in the country by at least 50%. This is a nice little bite taken out of that. But from my point of view, if we're going to deal with the post-China world and expand the industrial plant to manufacture everything we need to expand it by another 50%. So regardless if you're green, if you're pro-development, or both, this takes us a significant step forward. We still need like another 500 of these steps, but we're going in the right direction. Okay, number three, what it is. It's wind, and it's in New Mexico. So wind, as a rule, is much more cost-effective than solar, in large part because every time the sun goes down, all those solar panels just become paperweights, whereas the wind blows at night. In addition, while we have had incremental improvements in the capacity of photovoltaic cells over the last 15 years, it's nothing compared to what has gone on with wind. It used to be that wind turbines were 100 feet tall. Well, this year, we're going to have prototypes for ones that are 1,000 feet tall. Just massive, massive structures. And they generate more than an order of magnitude more power than the old ones do. And more importantly than their size is their height, because they're reaching wind currents that are far more stable and far stronger. And so we're seeing places in Texas, in Iowa, and now in New Mexico that are using some of these taller turbines to not just generate intermittent power, but baseload power. And that's one of the big problems with green tech. If the wind stops or the sun goes down, you're kind of out of luck and you have to switch to a more conventional system or a battery system, which is much more expensive. But if you are tapping a wind current that never stops, you can use it for baseload and avoid both of those problems. And that's part of the goal here for the SunZia project. But fourth, and I think most importantly, is that unlike almost every green tech project that we have done in the United States to this point, a huge portion of the SunZia project is transmission. They realize that there aren't a lot of people in New Mexico, and Albuquerque can only suck up so much power. And so this project includes massive transmission lines that go into Arizona and link into the network that goes into Los Angeles. And of the 3.5 gigawatts of power generation that they're anticipating, all but 0.5 gigawatt of it is for export to the Arizona and California markets. And the fact that this taps into the LA market is beyond awesome. I don't know how many of you have heard of California, but doing business there is almost impossible. Electricity demand is hardly encouraged, but in many ways, electricity generation is flat out illegal. A very heavy regulatory environment. The state is also very power hungry, and they import about 1/3 of their electricity because they've made it very difficult for producers to operate in their home state. Arizona is by far the single largest supplier they have. And every night when the sun goes down and all those panels the Californians built stop working, 10 gigawatts of fossil fuel power comes from Arizona across the border, flooding into the LA zone. The SunZia project will now be able to put roughly 3 gigawatts of power into that network. It doesn't solve it at a stroke, but it's a much more sustainable program from an environmental point of view than anything that we have right now. So, great step forward. One of the big things that we forget about in the wind and solar is not just the intermittency. It's just that not everybody's place is sunny and not every place is windy, and most people don't live in those locations. So our best wind locations are the Great Plains, from eastern Montana, North Dakota, going down to the panhandle of Texas and West Texas. Our best solar zone is from Southern California going into West Texas as well. New Mexico is on the edge of that Great Plains region. Great wind potential, great solar potential. But there aren't a lot of people in that entire area. You got to wire it somewhere. And this is one of those projects that has managed to work out the details of crossing state boundaries, 2 of them, and getting power to where people actually live in Phoenix and Los Angeles. So we need many, 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 many more of these for this to go. But the fact that we have our first really big one that's already started construction, first power is expected in 2026, it's a great start. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from snowy Colorado, where in the last 18 hours we've gotten 18 inches of snow, which means that this morning is a time for clearing and shoveling. But there is more to winter than shoveling and icicles. There is also the fun and games that comes with agriculture. In fact, winter is arguably the single biggest factor for how our world got to be in the shape it is more or less this century and last century. The issue is that when winter hits, everything stops, and you have a layer of moisture that then insulates the ground. This does 2 things. Number 1, it preserves a little bit of moisture in there, and then we'll get a little bit back in the spring. But more importantly, the thicker the snow, the greater the insulation. And so you actually still have biological processes going on under the surface, even right there in the topsoil. Basically, you've got organic material that is decaying, or as farmers like to call it, the formation of free fertilizer. If you look at the map of the world's agricultural zones before roughly 1900, the pre-industrial era, you'll notice certain patterns. The American Midwest, to a degree the American Piedmont, Northern Europe, Central Eurasia, the Rio de la Plata Basin in South America, and the southeastern part of Australia and South Africa. Sorry, I forgot Northern China as well. What do these areas all have in common? It gets cold. You get some snow. And so you get that recharge system. They're temperate climates where the free fertilizer is kind of baked into the cake. If you go outside of those zones pre-1900, it's not that there's not agriculture, but by definition, it's almost not large scale. And most of the crops that feed most of humanity, so you're talking rice, soy, wheat, and corn, those 4 crops grow best in those conditions. You move out of those zones and you're talking different crops, things like sweet potatoes or yams. And it's not that you can't support a population with those things. It's that you can't support a large population with those things. So they're not nearly as amenable to row croppage. It's more subsistence farming as a rule. Now, that of course changed right around between 1900 and 1945 for some countries, and then between roughly 1990 and 1995 for the rest. What happened there was first the development and then the mass application of industrial-level agricultural inputs, things like fuels and fertilizers, which allowed you to plant more traditional crops in zones that normally weren't really great for it. In addition, those lower output crops per acre, if you started putting things like fertilizer, they would do a lot better. As a rule, the industrialization of agriculture had a bigger impact on marginal lands than it did on the prime lands. The prime lands still saw their output increase by 50% to 150%, but it's the marginal lands that saw a tripling, quadrupling, or even more. Now, something to keep in mind with all those secondary lands. If you're talking about, say, a steppe where it's just dry, with agriculture nothing really happens. If you're talking about the tropics, yes, you have a riot of growth, but the nutrients are consumed by that growth as soon as the growth rots. So if you clear the jungle and the rainforest, the soil that's left behind is almost nutrient non-existent. And without those industrial level inputs, you really can't grow crops at scale in these zones. Now, because of industrialization of agriculture, we haven't simply seen the part of the world that humans cultivate expand by a factor of 3. We've seen the population expand by a factor of 3 as well. My concern is that we're entering an era where the supply chains that allow those industrial inputs to function, to exist, are going to break down. And for countries like China or Brazil, who import the vast, vast, vast majority of those inputs, that means the ability to sustain post-1900 levels of population are going to be hugely hit. In the case of Brazil, they still have portions of the country that are still temperate. It's not like they're going to starve, but they're no longer going to be a massive agricultural exporter to places like Brazil. So, for those of you who live in a place where you don't have snow, yes, you get more time on the beach and you don't have to shovel. But it also means the security of your food supply is decided by people in different climate zones with supply chains that are a continent away that you have no ability to protect or even influence. And in the world we're going into, that's going to get a little rough.